Hello everyone. In this video, we will talk about slope of a line. So in previous video, we are learning how to sketch the linear equation. And the linear equation is a straight line. Okay, and the straight line that you have will have a slope. So the slope measures the steepness of the line that you actually sketch. The formula for finding the slope of a line is equal to m, which is the notation for the slope. Remember that m is the lower case m. So the lowercase m representing the change in y divided by the change in x, or we usually call the word rise over run. And the advanced notation for the slope can be presented by delta y divided by delta x. That means you take y2 minus y1, x2 minus x1. Okay, it's always like this, y2 minus y1, x2 minus x1. So rise over run, or change in y divided by change in x. So for this delta y over delta x, you see them a lot in advanced calculus. Okay, so basically, in general, saying every day, we call it rise over run. So the slope of the line can be positive, negative, zero slope, or undefined. So if you have a line pointing this way or lying in this form on the graph, this you will have the positive slope. But it's this way, okay, you will have a negative slope. So the main point that I would like to emphasize for everyone on this figure or this diagram is when you have zero slope and when you have no slope. When the slope equal to 0, you do have the value for the slope, which is equal to 0. When you have no slope, that means you don't have any value for the slope. Okay, so when the slope equal to 0 and no slope are totally two different things. Okay, because they represent two different lines on the graph. Okay, so right here, I can zoom it in to show everyone that the slope of a straight line, and this one is also the slope of a straight line. But because of the steepness of the slope, we can define whether it's a 0 or it's no slope. So in this case, you have a horizontal line. This is the 0 slope because you cut the y-axis right here, all right? So that means you share the same values for y all the way through. If you take y2 minus y1 is equal to 0, then you will have x2 minus x1 is a number, and then you take that actual number, you divide into 0. In this case, you do have a 0. So 0 divided by a number is equal to 0. So this one, an actual value for that will be 0. But you take a look at this vertical line. This vertical line, you see that you will share the same values for x all the way through, right? So this is the value for x on the x-axis because you cut the x-axis at only this one point. So this point, you take x2 minus x1 will give you 0. So if you substitute into this equation, you will have 0 as a denominator. And if 0 as a denominator, it means undefined. In mathematics, you cannot divide it by 0. If you divide it by 0, it's called an undefined condition because we cannot divide it by 0. So because it shares the same values for x here. So denominator always equal to 0, which you cannot divide by 0. Therefore, this one is called no slope, or the slope is undefined. Okay, so don't forget the vertical line is the slope is undefined, or you have no slope because you don't see the steepness here at all, right? But here, this one, you have a horizontal line. Therefore, the slope is equal to 0 because you share the same value of y all the way through. You cut this line on the y-axis at one point. So that value for y will always be the same. So y2 minus y1 could be 0. But you take 0 divided by a number. Therefore, you have a 0 as the result. All right. So keep this in mind. There's 4 types of the slope that we must remember. Okay, and don't forget that when the slope is equal to 0, it's totally different when we say it's no slope. No slope, that means the slope is undefined and your denominator is equal to 0. Okay, excuse me. So let's move on to the next example. So for this example, it's asked me to determine the slope of a line passing through the 2 points, -3, -5, -6, -10. So the first thing you want to do is you want to identify x1, y1, x2, y2. So don't forget, it's a pair, okay? The pair with the x and y coordinates. So here x1, here's y1. So make sure that you label it correct, x2, y2. Okay, so then the formulas ask me to do this, m equal to y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. So you just apply the formulas. So the y2 in this case will be minus 10. Subtract the y1 will be -5, so I put -5 in the brackets. The x2 is -6. I subtract the x1, which is the -3, so I put -3 inside the bracket as well. So this will turn into -10. Okay, excuse me. I think I zoom out by mistake because I'm touching this line. Okay, so I'm going to zoom it back in. Okay, because I touched the zoom button on my screen. So that's what happened. So I will zoom it back in. So therefore, here is my -10 plus 5. Here I should have -6 plus 3. Okay, so this will give me -5 divided by -3. Okay, so you cannot leave -5 divided by -3. You have to say that negative divided by a negative will give you a positive answer. So m is equal to positive 5 over 3. You don't have to write a positive here. You can just say 5 over 3. So it's understanding that it is a positive. But I mentioned the positive here to make sure that negative divided by negative is a positive values. Okay, so this is your final solution here. So you will have a positive slope, 5 over 3. Okay, leave it as a fraction because you want to say rise over run. All right. Okay, you cannot leave your answer like this, -5 over -3. 3 doesn't divide evenly into 5, but the negative divided by negative will give it a positive. Therefore, your final answer is this. Okay. So let's learn the characteristic of the slope of a line. Okay, so after we know what the slopes is, we can find the slope of the line that is parallel to each other or the line that perpendicular to each other. So the definition here is this. So if M1 represents the slope of L1 and M2 is the slope of L2. Okay, so L1 is parallel to L2, then M1 equal to M2. Okay, so just make a note that L1 and L2 are non-vertical lines because the two vertical lines, they have no slopes, right? Okay, or the slope is undefined. So if L1 is perpendicular to L2, then the slopes are negative reciprocal of one the other. So negative reciprocal means that you take the value, divide into -1. Okay, you take the value, divide into -1 is called negative reciprocal of one and another. So when the two lines are parallel, the slope had to be the same. It's quite obvious. But when the two lines are perpendicular to each other, then the slope are negative reciprocal of one the other. And we will apply these formulas here to figure out the slope of the line that perpendicular to each other. Okay, so for this example, what we have here is we find the slope of the line is given as m equal to -3 over 5. So you see that I identify the negative with the rise and the 5 is for the run. Okay, so because it's given to me as, let's say, L1, okay, parallel to L2, therefore M1 equal to M2 is also equal to negative 3 over 5. So it will be the same. Okay, so if a slope of the line is given as m, this you can define it by m1, and this is your m2 will be the same because the line are parallel to each other. So now we are talking about L1 perpendicular to L2. Okay, so perpendicular to L2, then I will have m1 equal to negative 1 divided by m2, or I can use m2 equal to negative 1 divided by m1, right? Because we practice negative reciprocal of one to the other. So if you identify this as your m1, so given m1 equal to negative 3 over 5, I would like you to attach a negative 3 with the numerators, okay? Then what you have is m2 equal to negative 1 divided by the m1. Okay, so I'm going to write it like this. Negative 1 divided by negative 3 over 5. Okay, so how do we divide it by? Okay, divided by a fraction, what you do is you must change this into a multiplication. So negative 1, change that into a multiplication and flip the fraction over. Okay, you flip the fraction over. So when you take negative 1 multiplied by 5 over negative 3, negative, okay, negative and negative will make it a positive, and you leave your answer as 5 over 3. So if you have a slope of negative 3 over 5, the slope of the line perpendicular to this is equal to 5 over 3, negative reciprocal of one and the other. All right. Okay, so let's try example number 3. Okay, in this example, what I have is from the given information, determine whether line L1 or L2 are parallels or perpendicular or neither. Okay, so L1 is passing through this point and L2 is passing through this point. Okay, so what I will do is I will have to find the slope of L1 and the slope of L2. Right? So in order for me to know whether or not they are parallel or perpendicular, the slope is the factor that determines this characteristic of these two lines. Okay, so I'm going to identify the x1, y1, x2, y2. All right. Okay. So for m1 is the slope of L1. Right? So I will have y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. So I should have negative 14 subtract negative 10. And here I should have negative 7 subtract negative 5. Okay, so x2 minus x1. Okay, so x2 minus x1. y2 minus y1. So I should have negative 14 plus 10, denominator negative 7, negative 7 plus 5. So I should have negative 4 divided by negative 2. So this one should be equal to positive 2. Okay, so L1 will have a slope of positive 2. Okay, so now I'm going to find M2. Okay, so M2 equal to y2 minus y1, x2 minus x1. So I will have to identify the point as well. So I will say this one is x1, y1, x2, y2. So make sure you remind yourself of the coordinate. Okay, so in this case, I will have negative 24 subtract negative 21, put it in the brackets, and I should have 25 subtract 19, right? Alright, so this one I should have negative 24 plus 21. I should have 6 as the denominator, so I should have negative 3 over 6. So in this case, I should have negative 1 over 2. You need to reduce your fraction to lowest term. So M2 equal to negative 1 over 2. So L2 will have a slope of negative 1 over 2. Okay, so now I would like you to take a look at this. So you are going to compare, okay? So let's say M1 or M2 is the negative reciprocal of 1. So if you take negative 1, okay, you divide it by your M1, which is what you found as positive 2 right here. So this is 1 positive 2. So you take that, you divide it by positive 2, you get negative a half, which is exactly what you see right there, right? So this key will tell you that the L2 is perpendicular to L1, or L1 perpendicular to L2. Okay, so if you are choosing the other formulas to work with, if you are choosing M1 is equal to negative 1 divided by L2, so then you say negative 1 divided by L2, which you find as negative half. Okay, so negative 1 times negative 2 divided by 1. So in this case, what do you see? Negative times negative will make it a positive, and this is actually equal to 2. Okay, so it's true. Whatever formula you use to prove, it turned out to be L1 perpendicular to L2 or L2 perpendicular to L1. It's the same thing. Alright, so let's move on to the next example. So this example is very much similar, and I also have to identify L1, L2s are parallel or perpendicular or neither. Okay, so again, I will identify x1, y1, x2, y2. So for M1, okay, I should have, so let me change the color. M1 should be equal to y2 minus y1, x2 minus x1. So in this case, what I should have is I should have negative 18 subtract negative 11, the whole thing divided by negative 9, subtract negative 6. Okay, so y2 is negative 18, y1 is negative 11, x2 is negative 9, x1 is negative 6. Okay, so it helps to label the coordinates so that we won't get mixed up. So negative 18 plus 11 divided by negative 9 plus 6. So I should have negative 7 over negative 3, or I should have 7 over 3. Okay, so don't forget that you need to reduce your fraction to lowest term, and you have to take care of the negative sign as well. Okay, negative divided by negative is a positive. So L1 with slope M1 as 7 over 3. Okay, so now we move on to this line. So again, I will label my coordinate to make sure that I don't make an error here. Okay, so then y2 minus y1, x2 minus x1. So in this case, I should have 13 subtract 6 and 24 subtract 27. So what I have here is I have 7 over negative 3. Okay, so therefore L2 with slope m2 as 7 over -3. So is there a relationship between these two? Is there a relationship between 7 over 3 and 7 over -3 or -7 over 3? Okay, so this doesn't mean that one is a negative reciprocal of the other. One is positive, one is negative. They have no relation to the negative reciprocal of the other. But if you find negative reciprocal of this, it should be -3 over 7. It's not 7 over -3. So in this one, I would say neither. Okay, they are not parallel, they are not perpendicular, they probably cut each other at one point on the Cartesian plane. Okay, so the two lines with two totally different slopes would have no relation to each other in terms of negative reciprocal. Don't forget, it's a negative but not reciprocal. Alright, so let's see if I cover everything. Yes, I do. And I have the practice here for everyone to try. Okay, so solution is posted, and make sure you try all of this exercise. Okay, so let's see if I cover everything. In conclusion, okay, let's say in conclusion, is for this lesson, you need to recognize what kind of slope that you are dealing with and the formula to figure out the slope. The formula to figure out the slope is change in y divided by change in x. Recognize what kind of line that you have on the graph and visualize right away what kind of slope that you are dealing with. Okay, remember the slope equal to 0 is not the same as saying no slope. No slope, that means undefined. One line is vertical and one line is horizontal. So, and if they give us the value for the coordinates, you can figure out the values for the slope of this line. And if you have two lines, they can be parallel, they can be perpendicular, or they can intersect each other at one point. So the slope will determine that. Okay, the slope will determine that if the two lines are parallel to each other, that means their slope will be the same. Okay, because the two lines are parallel, that means they will have the same slope, and they don't cut each other at one point. Okay, on the Cartesian plane. However, in calculus, it will say that the two parallel lines will meet in infinities, but we don't have to prove that in this class. Now, when the two lines are perpendicular to each other, there's a special formulas for this. So the slope could be negative reciprocal of one and the other. What is negative reciprocal? That means you divide into -1. Okay, takes one slope, divide into -1. All right, and then from that theories, we can identify whether the slope of one line and the slope of the other line have the relationship with each other as a negative reciprocal, they are perpendicular, or they are parallel, or neither. Okay, so the last example that I have right here is to present to everyone that this one is a positive slope. They have the same, but one is positive, one is negative. Doesn't mean that they are perpendicular to each other. Okay, neither perpendicular, neither perpendicular, neither parallel, because they actually just the positive, one is positive, one is negative. Okay, thank you everyone.